Hi there, and welcome to the Autistica Research Festival. It's Thursday, we're on day 4, and you're here for the session on social relationships. I'm Rebecca Sterry, I'm Director of External Affairs at Autistica, and I'm going to be hosting the session this morning. Now, how autistic people experience and engage with themselves and others is vital to understand if we're aiming to create a more inclusive society. It also requires knowledge of how non-autistic or neurotypical people understand and engage with autistic people, since an inclusive society involves and requires shared knowledge and understanding. This stream will showcase autism research, exploring social experiences and ways of thinking, relating and engaging with others. So we've got lots of speakers this morning. We've actually got 7 in total, so it's going to be a really interesting session, and we're going to cover a really wide range of topics. But don't worry, we'll make sure that we have a little break in between so that you can collect your thoughts and have a bit of time away from the screen. So we'll do that after the 4th speaker today. You can read the speaker bios, and they're just going to be below the live stream, along with PDF versions of all of the speakers' slides, if you prefer to look at them in that format. I think we've got all of our speakers joining us for the Q&A today, which is great, and that will run at the end of the session once all the presentations have finished. So you can submit your questions at any time via the Q&A system, which is underneath the video, and these will be collected by my colleagues, and we'll try to get to as many as we can, but I think we're going to struggle to cover all of them with the number of speakers we've got. So some of our presenters have really kindly offered their email addresses, so you can get in touch with them after if you come up with other questions or if we don't quite get to your question. We're going to move on to our very first presentation, and that's from Laura Fox at the University of York.
Hello, my name's Laura Fox, and I'm a final year PhD student in the Education Department at the University of York. And today I'm going to talk to you about a study from my PhD, which explores how autistic children experience friendships. So the study looks at how Key Stage 2 children, that is between the ages of 7 to 11, attending a UK mainstream or special school, experience their friendships. It specifically looks at listening to children's voices, and it does so by trying to amplify what they think are their strengths and listens to their own opinions. It also includes parent and teacher initiatives, and the thesis is made up of 3 studies: a parental perspectives paper, a systematic review, and a multiple perspective arts-based study, which I'm going to talk to you about today. So we know that children's friendships are something which are important, and we know that they've been found to play a protective role against things such as bullying. They're a source of social support in neurotypical children, and they've been found to support major transitions, such as the move to a new school. And we also know that autistic children have, on average, significantly fewer mutual friendships than their non-autistic peers, and that they find it difficult to not only make friends, but maintain them. Studies have shown, however, that children do like having friends. It might just be that what they think of as friendship is different to what neurotypical people think of. So they tend to favour things such as companionship, and when they've been asked about their friendships, they've reported that they are satisfied with them, which suggests that they can and they do have friendships that they deem to be worthwhile. So my PhD wanted to look at how children experience their friendships and what they thought about their own friendships. And because of COVID-19, my PhD utilised remote methods, and when I was looking at how I could do this, I looked into non-verbal ways that might successfully gather information on children's experiences. And I came across lots of non-verbal ways of doing so through drawing in scrapbooks and disposable cameras, and I found research that had used these techniques to effectively facilitate discussions in semi-structured interviews by using the non-verbal tasks as a prompt. So there's a picture on the right hand side of some of the things from my activity pack. There's a scrapbook that was designed along with some colouring pens, a glue stick and some Play-Doh, and a child information sheet. Parents were recruited through social media and through schools, and then they were asked to fill in a consent form, which included asking for a postal address, and then everything that was needed to take part in the study was sent to parents' homes. The remote research meant that children could complete tasks in their own time. There was no need for me to schedule interviews or times to visit the homes with parents. They could do it as and when it was best for their child. And the scrapbook was designed about research questions, so each activity was linked to a specific research question, and then these research questions were further explored via parent-led interviews. So 20 children, their parents and teachers have taken part in the study. I did have some difficulty recruiting children from special schools, and those who did take part had difficulty engaging with the interview. However, I got a really nice gender split between males and females in mainstream schools, which I think is reflective of the data collection techniques used. So throughout the study, I wanted to make sure that children were always at the centre, and this started right from the very beginning by making sure that they had their own child information sheet. So it was written in accessible language, it was checked by an early years Senko colleague of mine, and it explained what research was, what friendship was, why I was interested in speaking to them, what would happen with their drawings or their data once they had sent it back to me, how long it was going to take, and it reminded children that they didn't have to take part if they didn't want to, and they didn't have to complete every section if they didn't want to either. There was also a parental information sheet with the study which had prompts for helping children complete tasks if needed, but parents were encouraged to sort of let children take part on their own if they were able to. So there's an example from the very beginning of the scrapbook here. There's a how-to page with every single section, which aimed to explain the task to children in sort of simplified language. And at the bottom of every how-to page was another reminder that children didn't have to take part in anything that they didn't want to, and they could skip any questions that they didn't want to answer. The aim of the All About Me section here that you can see on the right-hand side was just to give children a bit of ownership over their scrapbooks. So they were able to draw a picture of themselves and complete sort of like a status for what they've been doing throughout the day. And they were also able to provide a nickname, and if the nickname was far enough away from their actual name, that was used as a pseudonym throughout the study. So each section of the scrapbook is laid out in a similar way, and each section came with a parent-led interview schedule, so children could draw about the things that they liked doing, and then once their scrapbook had been completed, parents were asked to have a semi-informal conversation with their children, which was video recorded and then sent back to me. So each section came with questions and prompts, so you can see that the All About Me section started with "This section is all about you. What is it that you're doing here?" And then parents or carers were prompted to point at the "My Favourite Things to Do" box. And this was a similar thing throughout the whole study, so each section had its own interview schedule with it, and this was just used to explore children's drawings and find out a little bit more about what was important to them. So I haven't completed analysis for the study yet, but I have got some preliminary findings that I'm just going to share with you now. So this is an example from a boy in mainstream school, and he did have real life friends and he did talk about them. And he'd had the same friend since he was little, that his parents had met in the hospital, and he was really impacted by how his friend had moved away a few years ago, and this was really difficult for him, and it had been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And his mum was interviewing him, and she added a lovely question at the end that asked him if there was any advice that he could give to a child that wanted to make more friends, and he said that people should always be kind. And kindness is something that is coming up a lot throughout children's interviews and throughout children's scrapbooks. Lots of children think it's important for you to be kind as a friend, and that it's important for your friends to be kind to you. And this is another example from a boy attending mainstream school, and in the left-hand corner there's a drawing that he's done of himself on FaceTime with a friend, and they're playing Roblox together, they're video gaming together, and he was really open about talking about his friends, but he did so mainly linked to the fact that he wanted friends to play video games with, which links back to the literature about companionship. And you can see that he was really open to meeting new friends, because new friends might play Roblox and then he can play Roblox with them, and that was something that he really wanted to do. But he was aware of the fact that it wasn't just about playing games, and that not having friends was something that he had experienced in the past, and not having friends was something that made him really sad. W was the only child who attended a special school who managed to complete the interview, and he talked about friends a lot during his interview, and he listed off lots of names of people that he liked being around in school and people that were his friends. And his dad was carrying out the interview with him, and his dad sort of interjected to say that, he's said all of these names, but we don't really know who they are. We've not heard about them before. So we can't really confirm if they are his friends. But he does really like being around people, but he struggles to relate and he struggles with parallel play. And this might reflect the fact that, again, friendships to W were being around lots of people, and that was what he really wanted to do, and that was what made him happy. And you can see, again, and there's an example on the right-hand side of the perfect friend that children would make, and W has put the label kind again and cheerful, and this is something that's coming up a lot throughout the interviews. So Newton, I just have two more examples for you. Newton is a girl who was attending mainstream school, and she didn't really have any friends to talk about, especially at school, but she also didn't really want to talk about human friends. She really wanted to talk about the fact that her perfect friends would be animals, but she felt the need to keep apologising for this. She was very aware of the fact that it wasn't the social norm and that she felt like she had to speak about human friends, but that she really struggled getting on with humans. They weren't as easy for her to get on with, and they didn't understand her as much. And this was the same when she was talking about her real life friends. She chose to pick her horse for this as opposed to talking about anybody from school. And she was also really aware of her diagnosis and the fact that it was good for her to have friends because she was autistic, but she wasn't really sure why. And this was something that came up in a few interviews, specifically with females taking part in the study. 3 or 4 of the girls taking part said, I know I should have friends because I'm autistic, but I'm not really sure why. And then finally, I just have an example from Yaya, who was another girl in mainstream school. And she had several drawings throughout her scrapbook highlighting the fact that she just wanted friends that looked and acted like her, including this plasticine model that she sent in. And she thought it was really important to have kind friends and friends that didn't hurt her feelings. And she spoke in depth about some of her experiences with her friends at school. And she'd had a friendship group from a really early age, but as they moved into year 3, her friends wanted to do more grown-up things, which has links back to the literature about children having different expectations of their friendships. And she was another person who was quite aware of her diagnosis, and she thought that sometimes she said things in the wrong way, and that's why she might have been losing her friends. So, for example, she spoke about how one of her friends had fallen out with her because they'd asked if her drawing was really good, and she'd said no, and that had caused an upset, and she couldn't understand why that had caused an upset because good friends told the truth and she was just telling the truth, so she didn't really understand why her friends were falling out with her. So we've seen that there's a common theme of companionship coming up across all of the sort of interviews and the scrapbooks that we've got back. Help and being kind seems to be really important to children, as does having friends who are sympathetic to their needs. Lots of children spoke about the fact that they have difficulties with their peers. And for many, especially those in mainstream, they were really aware that being autistic meant that their friendships might be different. So I'm currently carrying out reflexive thematic analysis. I'm doing 3 separate analyses for each block of data. So I've got parent, teacher and child data. And then I'm going to explore gender differences and school setting differences. And I'll discuss each analysis independently before talking about any similarities and differences between the groups. I've used multiple perspectives in the study, but I've used them to explore different perspectives of a central issue as opposed to using parent and teacher reports to back up what children have said. So thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation. I'm now going to hand back over to the chair, and I'll happily take any questions that you might have in the live Q&A.
Thank you, Laura, for sharing your work with us. It's really lovely to see the wide range of ways you've got the children to contribute, and their depictions of friends were just really lovely and really wide-ranging. And that theme of kindness coming through from all of the children there kind of leads on to our next speaker, Emre Deniz, also from the University of York. He's going to be talking about sibling bullying.
Hi, it's Emre Deniz. I'm a final year PhD student in the Psychology and Education Research Center at the University of York. I'm also a member of the Child and Adolescent Neurodevelopmental Diversity Research Lab supervised by Dr. Umar Tosif. In the Candy Lab, our main research interests lay around play skills, sibling relationships, mental health and well-being in autistic children and adolescents. Today, I'm going to present one of our latest studies in which we tested the indirect effects of sibling bullying on the mental health and well-being of autistic adolescents. To the best of our knowledge, this is the first study in reporting the mediator role of self-esteem in this association. Before I jump into our study design and findings, I'm going to give a very brief background about the importance of having a sibling and the characteristics of sibling relationships in both neurotypical and autistic populations. In the general population, we know that siblings feature heavily in children's lives. About 85–90% of children grow up with a sibling and spend most of their time with their siblings until they reach adolescence. Although there are infinitely good aspects of having a sibling, the relationship between siblings binds them in both positive and negative ways. In terms of positive sibling relationships, they provide limitless opportunities to children for developing their various skill sets such as social communication skills, problem-solving skills, emotional and behavioral regulation skills. Children with negative sibling relationships, however, develop emotional and behavioral difficulties, perform poorly at school, and they are likely to experience peer rejection later in their lives. Similarly, sibling relationships of autistic children are characterized by both positive and negative interactions. On the positive side, we know that autistic children have longer stability and closeness in their relationships with their siblings. On the negative side, however, it has been reported that autistic children have higher levels of aggressive and disruptive behaviors in their sibling relationships. So, what is sibling bullying? There is a well-known and widely accepted definition of sibling bullying made by Dr. Dieter Wolke, who defines it as frequent and repeated aggressive behaviors that intend to harm the weaker sibling physically, verbally, socially, or psychologically. From his definition, we understand that there are four main components of sibling bullying, which are an unwanted aggressive behavior, frequent repetition, intention of harm, and power imbalance. Any harmful sibling behaviors that lacks any of these main components can be characterized as sibling conflict, but not bullying. For example, it's not bullying when two siblings who are equal in power harm each other repeatedly, as there is no power imbalance between them. There are two different forms of sibling bullying, direct bullying and indirect bullying. Direct bullying usually occurs between two individuals and aims to hurt the victim by causing an immediate damage. For example, physical bullying, verbal bullying, damage to property. Indirect bullying, however, usually involves others such as peers and family members and aims to ruin the social reputation of the victim. Arguably, indirect bullying is seen as the most detrimental type of bullying. So what's the importance and correlates of sibling bullying? Sibling bullying is the most prevalent form of violence in children's and adolescents' lives. Nearly 50% reported having been involved in sibling bullying, either as a bully, victim, or both. In the general population samples, sibling bullying is associated with anxiety and depression, psychological distress and self-harm, internalizing and externalizing problems, and poorer self-esteem and well-being. These associations between sibling bullying and mental health appear to be comparable irrespective of the sibling bullying role. Although sibling bullying is widely studied in the general population, only a few studies have focused on autistic adolescents. From the limited studies that focus on autistic adolescents, what we know that autistic adolescents who are involved in sibling bullying in early adolescence show poorer negative mental health in their middle adolescence. However, no study to date has investigated whether sibling bullying in early adolescence is associated with mental health difficulties in late adolescence. Therefore, the potential long-term implications of sibling bullying on the mental health and well-being of autistic adolescents remain unknown. From the literature, we know that sibling bullying is correlated with reduced self-esteem and increased mental health difficulties. In addition to this, we also know that self-esteem is correlated with positive and negative mental health. Although there are limited studies conducted on autistic samples, the literature suggests that reduced levels of self-esteem is correlated with increased levels of internalizing and externalizing problems and poorer well-being in autistic adolescents, youth, and adults. That is, autistic individuals with low self-esteem have more internalizing and externalizing problems and poorer well-being. Although the literature suggests a link between sibling bullying and self-esteem, sibling bullying and mental health, and self-esteem and mental health, the evidence on the longitudinal associations between sibling bullying, self-esteem, and mental health and well-being in autistic adolescents is limited. The current study therefore aims to investigate whether sibling bullying in early adolescence is associated with mental health and well-being in late adolescence, to investigate the relationship between sibling bullying and self-esteem in early and middle adolescence, to investigate the relationship between self-esteem in middle adolescence and mental health and well-being in late adolescence, and lastly, to investigate whether the associations between sibling bullying in early adolescence and mental health and well-being in late adolescence are mediated by self-esteem in middle adolescence. So this is a longitudinal quantitative study in which the data came from the UK Millennium Course study. So we drew a sample of 416 autistic adolescents aged 11 to 17 who had at least one sibling at ages 11 and 14. Since this was a secondary data analysis, the dataset contained a lot of missing data. To handle the missing data in the dataset, we used two advanced statistical techniques: multiple imputation by chained equations for descriptive statistics and maximum likelihood with missing values for inferential statistics. We also had four very well validated and standardized measures. The first measure was sibling bullying questionnaire for measuring sibling bullying. We had Rosenberg self-esteem scale to measure self-esteem, and difficulties questionnaire to measure mental health difficulties, and we had Warwick-Edinburgh mental health well-being scale to measure well-being of autistic adolescents. All measures were adolescent self-reported measures, and all analyses were conducted on state MP 17. Now we can talk about our study findings. In terms of the demographic characteristics of the sample, the mean age was 11.16 at time 1. There were 324 boys, which was the 78% of the sample. There were 175 firstborn children. The majority had one only sibling. The majority of adolescents lived with two parents, and 171 children were coming from low-income households, that is, lived in poverty. Regarding the prevalence and demographic correlates of sibling bullying, in early adolescence, over half of autistic individuals reported being victimized by a sibling, whilst 40% reported bullying a sibling at least once a week. In middle adolescence, however, the corresponding figures dropped to 30% for victimization and 24% for perpetration. We also found that adolescents who had their own bedroom, lived with two parents, and had one only sibling were less likely to be victimized compared to those who had shared bedroom, lived with a single parent, and had two or more siblings. In terms of our inferential findings, we tested 4 different structural equation models to answer our research questions. All SEM models showed good model fits. In the SEM figures, the red arrows represent significant negative associations, bold black arrows represent significant positive associations, and dotted arrows represent non-significant associations. This is our first SEM model in which we tested whether sibling victimization predicts self-esteem and internalizing and externalizing problems controlling for self-esteem at age 11 and sibling victimization at age 14. As can be seen on the model, the results suggested that being victimized by a sibling at age 11 reduced the levels of self-esteem at age 14, and in turn, reduced levels of self-esteem at age 14 increased internalizing and externalizing problems in autistic adolescents at age 17. That is, unlike a direct association, sibling victimization directly increases mental health problems by reducing self-esteem of autistic adolescents. In the second model, we tested whether perpetrating a sibling at age 11 predicts self-esteem at age 14 and internalizing and externalizing problems at age 17. Our findings indicated that perpetrating a sibling at age 11 reduced the levels of self-esteem at age 14, and in turn, reduced levels of self-esteem at age 14 increased internalizing and externalizing problems at age 17. As it can also be seen there wasn't any significant direct associations between sibling perpetration at age 11 and mental health problems at age 17. That is, unlike a direct association, sibling perpetration at age 11 indirectly increases mental health problems at age 17 by reducing the self-esteem of autistic adolescents at age 14. In our third model, we tested whether being victimized by a sibling at age 11 predicts self-esteem at age 14 and well-being at age 17. Similar to the previous models, our findings indicated that being victimized by a sibling at age 11 reduced the levels of self-esteem at age 14, and in turn, reduced levels of self-esteem at age 14 decreased the well-being of autistic adolescents at age 17. There wasn't any significant direct associations between sibling victimization at age 11 and well-being at age 17. That is, unlike a direct association, sibling victimization at age 11 indirectly decreased well-being of autistic adolescents at age 17 by reducing their self-esteem at age 14. In our final model, we tested whether perpetrating a sibling at age 11 predicts self-esteem at age 14 and well-being at age 17. Similar to the previous model, our findings indicated that perpetrating a sibling at age 11 reduced levels of self-esteem at age 14, and in turn, reduced levels of self-esteem at age 14 decreased the well-being of autistic adolescents at age 17. There wasn't any significant direct associations between sibling perpetration at age 11 and well-being at age 17. That is, unlike the direct association, sibling perpetration at age 11 indirectly decreased the well-being of autistic adolescents at age 17 by reducing their self-esteem at age 14. To conclude, our findings demonstrated that increased rates of sibling bullying in early adolescence were associated with lower levels of self-esteem in middle adolescence. In addition, reduced self-esteem in middle adolescence predicted poorer mental health and well-being in late adolescence. As it can be seen on the chart, our findings suggested that there is an indirect association between sibling bullying and mental health through self-esteem instead of a direct association. As implications, we suggested that increased bystanders' awareness can potentially be effective in reducing sibling bullying, therefore increasing the self-esteem of such group and protect their mental health and well-being. Thank you for your time. I would also like to thank all autistic adolescents and their parents who took part in the Millennium Course study. Just a reminder, you can further read our article and all other resources used in this presentation on my OSF profile. I will now hand over to the chair of this session, who will introduce the next presenter. If you have any questions, please save them to the Q&A session, where I will be gladly answering them.
Thank you, Emre. Really good to see that you've identified a big gap in the research there, and good to know that autistic teens are being focused on with this kind of bullying that can obviously have a major impact on their lives. We're now going to move on to our next presentation, presentation number 3, from a team at the Turing Institute, otherwise known as AutSPACEs.
Welcome. My name is Georgia Aitkenhead. I'm a researcher at the Turing, specialising in participatory and citizen science.
Hi, I'm Sophia. I'm a researcher and community manager at the Turing Institute.
Hi, I'm Susanna, and I am co-lead for moderation on the AutSPACEs project.
Hi, I'm Otis. I'm one of the collaborators for this project.
We're also here representing the wider AutSPACEs community, which is an open, neurodiverse and pro-neurodiversity community, including open source developers, volunteers, autistic collaborators and family members of autistic people. So we'd like to acknowledge all of you and your hard work as well. So firstly, I'd like to give a brief overview of AutSPACEs. AutSPACEs is a collaboration between Autistica and the Alan Turing Institute, which is the UK's National Institute for Data Science and AI, and it stands for Investigating Sensory Processing for Accessible Community Environments. We're using a methodology combining participatory research with elements of open source development to co-create an online citizen science platform, and we'll unfold those elements throughout this presentation. AutSPACEs seeks to address a specific challenge, which is that 90% of autistic people experience sensory processing differences compared to non-autistic people. And importantly, the challenge lies not in the fact that this is a defect, which it isn't, but that many environments, such as hospitals and schools, are not built with neurodiversity in mind. And this means that lots of public spaces are not accessible or uncomfortable for many autistic people to be in. So we want to change that.
So many traditional research projects would start with an idea, such as autism and sensory environments. They will then come up with a plan on how to design the study and the methodology. They'll go out, recruit participants, collect the data, organise the data, analyse the data, and then maybe publish it in a journal for access. Some studies will also then store the data and reuse it for future work. But with the AutSPACEs project, we've changed things up a little bit. We've taken community-driven questions and designed our methods around collaboration and co-creation to develop a citizen science approach using fair data management, and we openly share and publish all of our results and discoveries throughout this process. So where have these questions come from? So in a survey from Autistica that have identified the top 10 questions for autism research, we've focused on 2 of them with the AutSPACEs project. The first being focused on understanding which environments and supports were the most appropriate in terms of achieving the best life outcomes for autistic people. And the second focus being around how can sensory processing and autism be better understood. How we've actually designed the methodology around us is by leading with a nothing about us, nothing without the autistic community, without us, without the autistic community. As George has explained, what this has developed into is an online citizen science platform where people who are not professional scientists can engage in research at scale. The research design and methodology have been driven by the needs and asks of the community, so that the study being done, so that the results are more reflective of the wider population, real world experiences, and that whatever results we come up with or that come out of the project are then done in support and service of the community because of this collaborative co-creative design. We've embedded this co-creation throughout the project. What we're going to go through here is an example of when we took feedback from a focus group about what the platform should look like. A lot of the feedback was asking that the design be simple, only have one thing at a time, because our community did better when there's always less information on one page and it's not too cluttered. So we went from feedback from focus groups to design decisions. We then held consistent co-working and meetup groups to iterate across our designs and then come out with a platform that was built by our community for our community. The goal of this platform is that it's not just meant to be researchers informing the community back what the best environments, what the best supports are, and what the relationship between autism and sensory processing is. The platform gathers these real world experiences. This is a quote from an autistic parent of an autistic person explaining the importance of the platform, that it's not just about expert advice, is that everyone's coming to the platform sharing their life experience, because if it helped someone, I'm sure it can help others. The idea here is so that there is a virtuous cycle throughout the research process, is that instead of just coming up with a design, gathering the data and implementing it, we're using citizen science. So citizen scientists inform the research process and the research design, as well as then become scientists themselves gathering the data. I'm now going to hand over to Otis to talk about his take on citizen science throughout the AutSPACEs project.
Thank you, Sophia. My take on the citizen science project has been very engaging, very proactive, but most of all, I learned so much over the course. It's been very delightful, memorable. I couldn't have asked for more, really, because being a part of the citizen science project has given me a new take on things. It's given me so much purpose and clarity on things that I would never have considered or gone towards. But at the same time, it has challenged me, it's shaped me, it's made me look at things in a new light. I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to be able to have the opportunity to be a part of the group, meet different people alongside, working with different collaborators and people I would never have dreamt of working with. So it's been a real joy in itself. I'm glad that things are going the way they've been going now, because I remember when I first started, it was developing already, but it's very expanded even more so. I'm grateful to be able to have this opportunity today to explain my take on the project, because it's not just for autistic people, it's for many, many more people, but just that this part of it means a great deal, just like any other project would. We all have our different reasons and purposes, but when it comes to our ideas, it really does shape what we can do. There's no limitations. There's no such thing as a right or wrong answer or a silly question, because I think those are the things that make our work very resourceful, reliant, very true and meaningful. Well, thank you for today, and I really appreciate all that you've done and taking the time to listen today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Otis. So also integral to AutSPACEs is the respectful and responsible management of people's data. So this means giving people agency over how their data is used and who it's shared with, and giving users options whether to share it publicly for research, and giving people the option to easily withdraw consent. This contrasts with all or none consent, which is often used in research. Yet transparency and openness are also vital to AutSPACEs, so that the community can have insight and access to the project and to maximize the reproducibility of the research. So we use GitHub for project management, co-working and platform development. This allows a real-time record of our research and means that we can collaborate asynchronously with contributors from across the globe, and people can contribute according to their own schedules. So I'm now going to hand it over to Susanna, who's going to talk to you about open research and moderation.
So based on everything that Georgia has said, and Sophia as well, we want to move towards a world where research is openly licensed and widely available whilst being collaboratively created and shared. An example of where we have done this is within our moderation system and our code of conduct. So we held focus groups, that is how I first got involved in the project. We then built user personas based on the information we gathered to decide what people needed based on why they'd been using the site. We then reviewed that and compared it to existing frameworks before creating our own version of a code of conduct and getting feedback from the community. And then one of the most difficult parts of this, however, is that we want all voices to be heard. And we want this to be a site where users have freedom of expression whilst also being able to stick to the project's ethos and making it a safe and inclusive space. And this is even trickier when you try and find the balance between inclusivity and authenticity. A lot of current research is second-hand based, and there's no way to prove whether that information is genuine or not. So we've created a whole section in our COC specifically for those reporting on behalf of others, with the hope that they will be giving facts and not opinions. So my son covered his ears as the train went past, the train was loud, not my son covered his ears because the train was loud. And this is a bit tricky because it goes against some of the feedback that we received. As you'll see in this quote, we don't want it to be about neurotypical people talking about non-neurotypical people. However, we're doing this in order to put the autistic voice first. And this is the bit that I find most exciting and I'm most proud of. We have created a traffic light system in order to moderate. So red break COC will not be approved for public sharing. Those posting just for research don't get moderated. Green meets all requirements. That's great. And amber is the exciting bit. It doesn't break the code of conduct, but it may contain potentially triggering content, so will be flagged. And what you can see here is a mock-up of the site. There are 2 stories posted here, and the second one is tagged as potentially triggering. And what's even more cool is there is no preview. So there's no risk of people scrolling and accidentally coming across something that they find upsetting. And on top of this, we have come up with a list of topics that we think may be triggering based on the research that we've done so far and other projects that exist. And when people sign up, they can let us know which of those topics they find upsetting, and they don't have to see anything that has been tagged with that. So with everything that has been said, we are creating a project that gives people the opportunity to share their stories and their techniques in order to educate neurotypical people to better support them, whilst advising organisations on how they can design and adapt spaces to improve autistic people's lives. And with everything that has been said by Georgia, Sophia and myself, this using an open license code also means that everything we have been created can be adapted to answer other research questions and support other participatory projects. So in order to hopefully create longer, healthier, happier lives for autistic people in a more accessible, diverse and inclusive world. So we'd like to say thank you for listening, and thank you to our team, particularly AutSPACEs, Open Humans and the Citizens Science, as well as Kirsty Whitaker, James Cusack, and above all else, our amazing autistic collaborators. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. It was really great to hear from all of the people, well, many of the people involved in the project. It's great to hear all of the effort that you've gone to make sure that absolutely every voice is heard as part of this project. And brilliant to hear that there's open code as well, so that other people can learn from the work that you've done in this area and hopefully speed up progress. A really great approach to research. We'll now move on to our last presentation before we go for a short sort of 10-minute break. And this is Caroline Hearst, and she runs an autistic community group called AutAngel.
Hi, I'm Caroline Hearst. I am the founder and a director of AutAngel, which is an autistic-run community interest company. And I'll be talking about creating a community when they told us we couldn't connect. So I'm also a late identified and late diagnosed autistic adult. I discovered that I was autistic in the way that many autistic adults do, by just reading a random article in the paper. And from there, it just sparked enough interest that I was able to read everything at that time that there was about autism that was written by autistic people, and to feel pretty sure that this sort of was explained the particular specific issues that I'd had in my life. And so I was really keen to meet other autistic people. And I was told at that time, incorrectly, it turned out that I needed a diagnosis to go to the local peer support group. So I put it off and I got a diagnosis. And I just found that support group immensely helpful. I also knew, because I trained as an art psychotherapist, that there was nothing in that sort of training about autism. And I also had experienced a lot of therapy from the other side, and not a single person suggested that I might be autistic. And not only that, when I told some of them, they were totally astonished and I think didn't really believe it. So the idea of what autism was, the sort of myths about autism, were much stronger then than they are now, but they still persist. It's still a very stigmatized condition. So I'm just going to move forward and show, let you listen to a couple of audios of people who have come to our community and how that has impacted them. Now, unfortunately, I've just got to show you another slide because sometimes this glitches when I try it, so it'll be better.
For me, living life up until the point in time that I started to come to the groups has been like going through the motions. I was functional. I had a good job. I had a career. I had a family. But there was never something, there was something missing. There was something about me that I couldn't quite get to grips with. I suffered a lot with depression to the point of almost committing suicide at one point.
And this is the next one. This behaves differently. I've tried recording it before. Oh, no.
I hadn't knowingly met autistic people before. So just to meet other people who I knew either thought they were autistic or had a diagnosis was like a major revelation to me, because they were completely normal, if you know what I mean. They were just normal people. I don't know what I thought they would be like, but it just made me feel more accepting of myself to meet other people who had the same sort of troubles or issues or thought the same way that I did. And even just meeting these other people made a big difference to me. But going every week and having different topics that just sparked something in your mind that you hadn't thought of before, and you hadn't realised that's why you struggled with things. So I really enjoyed having Caroline as sort of leading the group. She really knew what she was talking about, being autistic herself, and you felt like you could open up much more to her than if it was someone who you knew wasn't autistic themselves. You just felt happier about sharing that part of you with other people that you hadn't, well, for me, I hadn't ever talked to anyone about it before.
This is just a diagram of autism, where autism sits in society, really, which is on the edges. So on the left, there's the human constellation, so all those little dots are people, and the autistic people are the ones at the extremes on the outer, but on every edge. So we're not all similar, we're often more different from each other than we may be from an individual neurotypical person. So that on the right is just the autism constellation. And I'm now going to show you this in 3D because over time, depending on where you're looking at it from and where people are looking at us from, people who appear to be quote unquote normal might well turn out to be autistic, and at different points in the development, our autism becomes more evident to us and maybe to others. So this is just a diagram that shows this. So we're just going to sort of move it along. So that one in the middle, it looked fairly central, but now you can see that it's really outside of the main cluster. So how do all these people who are very diverse form a community when the definition of community is a social, religious, occupational, or other group sharing common characteristics or interests and perceived or perceiving itself as distinct in some respect from the larger society in which it exists? So the problem here is with a stigmatized condition is people wanting to be part of a community that is stigmatized. So to join that community, you have to actually identify as autistic. And that, as I say, is often difficult for people just because of the stigma and because of the way that to date, autism has been defined as a sort of medical, actually psychiatric condition, or it's not considered a psychiatric condition, but it's in the psychiatric manuals. And it's been defined by deficits, and nobody wants to be defined by deficits. So to enter the community, you have to identify as autistic. And another issue here is that there's an entity called the Autism community, which supposedly includes all stakeholders in autism, which essentially means anybody who is involved in any way with autism, including a lot of people who just want to make money from autistic people and or parents of autistic children. So really that isn't a community in the sense of having a common interest. It's got a common denominator. So what we're talking about here is the autistic community, so the community of autistic people. And the other problem within the autism community, which is often people's first contact is with like a major charity. And although these charities are changing, they were started initially mostly by parents and are often quite paternalistic. So people are grateful to find something, but often they're then sort of roped in to provide information and inform people, but they're not paid. So the supposed experts and professionals who are telling us that we're a deficit based, that our identity is deficit based, are paid to do this. And yet when we share information with them, historically, it's been difficult to get paid to do that. So one of the things that we're very determined in AutAngel is that autistic people should get paid for their work. And that work includes offering support and training about autism and to other autistic people. So this is just a relevant quote from Gary Young, which is, "Many struggle with the idea that they belong to groups they never asked to join. Their reticence in this regard is both understandable and unsustainable. For some, these evasions are easier than for others, whether we claim them selectively or not, our identities have a habit of sticking with us. So when we had research done very generously by Dr. Laura Crane into our Exploring Being Autistic program, and how, did the participants find it useful? What did they like about it? And this was done, I don't know the exact term, but essentially the themes came out of the results from talking to the participants. They weren't predetermined by the researchers. And this was also excellent research because it was done at our request, unusually. So it wasn't like the interests of researchers who were driving this. It was a very generous researcher who was willing to work with us and research our program. So these were the key things that were important to people about the program. So it was that it was autistic led, that there was unity and diversity, so there were very many different people, and that we were able to develop a positive practical outlook on autism. So as I say, people appreciated that we were positive about autism, that we didn't regard it as a negative, that we regarded it as just a natural part of human neurodiversity. But we also recognised that there was a need to find a balance for people. So in order to utilise the strengths of being autistic, we need to be able to identify and mitigate our challenges. And that was what one of those tapes was saying earlier, that it was helpful to know that she was not alone in those challenges, and they weren't like personal failings, they were just part of being autistic. And knowing that helps you to deal with them more effectively. We also organisationally need to do the same. So in order to support autistic people, we need to support ourselves. So we want the people at AutAngel to be paid and to be appropriately paid and supported. And we also want to support autistic people regardless of their financial resources. So that can be a little bit of a challenge, and that is the thing that we're trying to balance. So I realise I've come to the end of my time here, so thank you very much for your attention, and I will hand you back now to the person chairing this. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Caroline. It's really great to hear about these safe and supportive and autistic-led spaces that exist for autistic people, and great to hear how you're able to kind of work together as a group to advocate for things like making sure that autistic people are paid for their time. Really, really important. So I'll now hand over to our fifth speaker, and that's Stewart Rapley.
Hello, I'm Stewart Rapley, and today I'm going to talk to you about autistic cognition and its impact on faith and church engagement. I'm now retired and operate as a freelance theologian. I'm the author of the book Autistic Thinking in the Life of the Church. I'm a member of the advisory group at the Centre for Autism and Theology at Aberdeen University. I'm the autism lead for Church for Everyone programme, and I'm a trustee at the National Autistic Society. So, autistic people then, less religious or simply thinking differently? And there's one of these common tropes that autistic people are just not religious. My own personal experience as an autistic Christian is that I found an escalating level of discord between my faith understanding on the one hand, that presented by the church, and then that articulated by others in the congregation. As I came to research the topic, I found some writers operating on the back of brain scan experiments who claim that autistic people are indeed less religious than neurotypical people. Others were a bit more nuanced, and they challenged this view, and I've just quoted one here, Reddish, Tock and Kund, who argued that it may well be that autistic people were simply thinking differently about their religion, in their terms, less anthropomorphically. So anthropomorphic referring to the way in which we attribute human-like characteristics to, say, pets or animals, or inanimate objects even. This presentation summarises a small qualitative study that I did in my MA, in which I interviewed 9 autistic Christians around the UK about their experience. So in terms of my method, I've said there were 9 participants. You can see from this table here that they came from a range of different Christian traditions, a range of church sizes. They were spread age-wise. I didn't ask them to declare their gender preference, but I'm just reporting here as presented to me, as understood by me. So 6 male, 3 female. So what I did then was I interviewed them in depth about their experience and their perspective on 4 things: their concept of God, their approach to prayer, their approach to the Bible, and then their approach to what I called supporting texts. So creeds, liturgies, hymns, songs, and so on that get used in the church context. I wanted to understand from them their personal perspective about their own thoughts on this subject, but also their perspective about how they saw the church presenting these topics, and also how they saw their congregations articulating them. What I then did was talk to them about some of the practical ramifications. What are the accommodations that they had made or that their churches had made for them? And what were the recommendations that they might make to the church to improve things? Just 1 or 2 notes here, just to be aware that these people are all positive people with long-standing relationships with their churches that seem to be working out. What this is not is a study on the social or sensory aspects of church. I found lots of other people had written about that. This is about the cognitive side of things. And of course, it's a qualitative study, so therefore it's going in depth and telling us something about how these people are thinking and so on. But it is only 9 people, and so we need to be aware that this is indicative in terms of its results rather than determinative of all autistic people. So the outcomes then. So what did these people make of their concept of God? So taking that anthropomorphic question, did they think of God as a being, as a person, as someone with whom we can have a relationship, or non-anthropomorphically, God not as a person, spirit, force, and so on? And their preference was to come down towards the non-anthropomorphic side. And I've quoted the theologian Paul Tillich there, who talks about God as the source of all being rather than God as a being. If you think about it, when you start talking about prayer, if you think about God in this anthropomorphic human-like way, then it makes sense, if you're having a relationship with God, to talk about prayer as talking to God, talking with God. If you are thinking non-anthropomorphically, that doesn't make so much sense, and it might be more sensible to talk about being in God or being with God, simply being with God. And that was the direction in which my autistic participants went, talking about prayer as being with or being in God. When it came to the Bible, then my participants were very well aware that they were likely to take and read things fairly literally. So the question was, can they read and understand the Bible, as it were, instinctively and naturally, or do they need to get help with interpretation? And they were very honest about this, and basically said to me I know that I'm likely to take things literally. That's not a great idea with the Bible. I need help in interpretation. What I see with my neurotypical friends, though, is they are much more confident to read and interpret the Bible instinctively for themselves. It obviously means this, it obviously doesn't mean that, and so on. With the supporting texts, then the discussion went around 2 points. Do we see these texts as providing a community reinforcement function? So a bit like a football crowd and its chants, it just kind of gives you a sense of being together, oneness with the group, or is it about truth reinforcement, just reminding you of the truth of what you believe and what your faith is about, and so on. And the autistic preference here was very much in the direction of truth reinforcement. I spend my time analysing the words. Do the words make sense? Do they contradict each other? Do they contradict the sermon, the hymns, and so on? And I see my congregation friends as being rather more interested in the community side. It's lovely to be together, sing this, say this, together around the country and through history and so on. So just to summarise that, here's a chart in which I put together on the left-hand side all of the sort of systemic emphasis factors, and on the right-hand side all the relational emphasis factors. And you can see that for each of my 4 areas, the participants saw themselves as to the left of the systemic side, with the churches broadly central, but even then leaning to the relational aspect to some extent, and the congregations leaning even further to the right to the more relational approach. Now, what that meant was that these people saw a gap between themselves and their churches. They were broadly on either on the fringe or beyond, and an even larger gap between the people I interviewed and their congregations, as perceived by themselves. And so 2 questions emerging from that. First of all, is their church engagement at risk? They're clearly hanging in there, but at a cognitive level, it's not really working terribly well. So something is holding them together, but there seems to be a risk. Can autistic Christians rebalance the church? Is there a contribution that they could be making that moves the churches back to the centre? Because all of these perspectives are there and valid in the Christian tradition. And at a practical level then, the questions that come up had to do with, wouldn't it be great if the church understood more about autism, and so the whole education and comms sense, creating a space where we can have a meaningful dialogue with each other. The church needing to be aware of its theological assumptions and how it thinks about autism and autistic people, and very easy to make rather unconscious assumptions about people. Thirdly, equipping in Bible interpretation. How do we help people to get better at that? And fourthly, the wisdom of having some more in-depth expertise perhaps available regionally or nationally. And then, as I've mentioned in my intro, there's an ongoing programme called Church for Everyone, and as part of that, in the autism space, I am working through some of the practical implications of this study. So thank you very much for your time and attention. I'm going to pass back now to the team to coordinate the Q&A.
Hi, thank you, Stewart. We're not quite ready for the Q&A yet. We've got another couple of speakers, but we'll get around to that eventually. So do add your questions into the chat if you've got any for Stewart. Yeah, really interesting to hear different perspectives on the church from the autistic participants in your study, and always good to hear research that questions some of those common tropes that you mentioned. So our next speaker is going to be Martine van Driel, and she's going to be talking about social media.
Hi everybody, thank you all for coming. My name is Martine van Driel. I am an autistic researcher at Queen Mary University of London, and today I will be presenting part of the Autistic Adults Online project. Our team consists of Professor Nelia Coteco and Dr. Belen Barros-Peña and myself at Queen Mary University of London, and Professor John Vines at the University of Edinburgh. The title of the talk is Autistic Adults Online, Autistic Perspectives on Social Media. So firstly, I will be talking about some previous research about social media and autistic users. Then I will discuss why we study autistic views on social media and move on to our research approach and design. After which I will discuss in more detail the 5 themes that we identified in our interview data. And finally, I will finish with some conclusions. Social media has the potential to be a safe space for autistic people for several reasons. Firstly, it allows us to communicate with others from the comfort of our own home and gives the ability to step away from any overwhelming interactions. And also we can take more time to craft responses. They're also a place where autistic people can find communities around special interests as well as shared experiences. And there are features available to help with interpretation and understanding, such as emojis or GIFs, although these could also cause more difficulty for autistic people with the interpretation of what they mean. And while there are many positives, autistic users are generally more passive than neurotypical users, and autistic people often still camouflage online as they might do in person, suggesting that there is a need for improvement. So why should we study autistic views on social media? So in order to fully understand the positive potential of social media and the purpose of it for autistic users, we must listen to them first. And the goal of this project is to make recommendations to social media platforms to create more inclusive environments online by drawing on autistic users' experiences, opinions, and thoughts. So for this study, we worked with Autistica to recruit participants, and we had 35 participants in total with an average age of 41. Our youngest participant was 25 and the oldest was 66. And we also had a range of gender identities represented. We had 16 women, 12 men, and 7 non-binary or agender participants. And we also included a range of social media users. So while all participants had a Facebook or Twitter account or both, we included people who never posted to their account, as well as people who posted several times a day. So the research approach that we took is called linguistic ethnography. And this means that we observed how participants use Twitter and Facebook. We downloaded all of their Twitter and Facebook posts over a period of 3 months in order to analyze that. And then we interviewed each participant to learn more about how they use social media. And each of these parts of the research informs the next. So for instance, if we observed a particular hashtag that people used, we could then check that in our data set. So for Twitter, for instance, we had over 25,000 posts, whether this hashtag was used more often and how it was used. And then we would ask people about it in the interviews. But it would also work the other way around. So someone might bring something up in the interviews that we had not thought about or we had not noticed. And then we could go back to our observations and our analysis and look for those specific things brought up by our participants. So today I will talk about our interview data specifically. Each interview was designed to last between 60 and 90 minutes, although some were a lot shorter. It kind of depended on how much each participant had to say. And we asked participants about how they use social media, who they interact with on social media. And we also would ask them about 2 or 3 specific posts that we noticed during our observation in order to give them an example to talk in a bit more detail about how they would post on their social media. So each interview was transcribed, and then we analyzed the text for themes. So themes are topics that would appear across most of the interviews. And you will see that these themes tend to be a little bit broad, and this is to make sure that we can capture all the different kinds of opinions and experiences within each theme. The coding was done by myself, and I will discuss 5 of the themes that we found over the next few slides. So the interview themes were platform architecture, which is about the design of each social media platform, social norms, which is about norms or rules that participants observed, being authentic, about how participants might not have followed those rules that they noticed, connectedness, about how participants use social media to stay in touch, and control, which refer to how participants use social media in a specific manner true to them. I will now discuss each theme in more detail, and I will show you some examples from the interviews. Firstly, participants talked about how the design of a social media platform can both be positive or negative to them. So it can be positive because the specific features that are available might help people participate. So in the first example, participant T5 talks about retweets, and they said, the other reason to retweet is sometimes you read something and someone's just put what you think in a better way than you think you can. So having the design feature of retweets available helps this user to participate because it takes away the need to craft the perfect tweet or think of the right words, and it allows them to express themselves in an easier way. However, the design of the platform can actually also make it more difficult to participate. So in the second example, participant F2 says, I find the constant input of information. I do find it overwhelming and difficult. And this was a common topic in our interviews. Autistic users talked about the amount of information that's available on social media platform and the amount of information that appears as soon as you log in and how it constantly refreshes. And it can be really difficult to filter that information and know what is relevant to you and what to respond to and exactly how to use it. For the social norms themes, we observed that people were talking about norms, or the word that they would sometimes use is rules, in other people's behavior that they noticed. So in the first example of TF23, we can see that this participant is talking about a specific Facebook group and how people act in this group. So they said, I think because people tend to, in that group, they tend to post pictures of their cats to get attention, I guess, and to make people pay more attention to her, I guess. I don't know. So you can see that there's a level of uncertainty about these rules, like why people do them, what they're for, but not all participants struggled with trying to examine the reasons for the rules, and they could actually be seen as helpful. So in the second example, TF16, the participant talks about Facebook reactions, so things like likes, and nowadays you can also choose love or care. And we talked about how to choose, how they decide which reaction to use. And they said, I picked the reaction that most other people have used. So by observing what other people are doing, it again takes away some of the stress of trying to decide for yourself what might be appropriate. The next category we called being authentic. And this category also covers social norms, but in a different way from the previous category. So the previous category, we included examples where participants talked about noticing rules and following rules. Whereas in this category, people would talk about observing those norms or rules and then going against them in order to stay true and authentic to themselves. So this is really about people using social media in a way that feels instinctual and good to them. And we can see this really well in this example for participant F1, who talks about a change over time in their behavior. And they said, it feels more relaxed. And like, I know a lot of people feel that pressure to get likes. I used to, I will admit, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't. I don't really care anymore. I just go on, and I might see it's only got 2 likes. Don't really like that post anyway. I'm going to delete it. But it's the same. I could get 50 likes on a post and still think I'm going to delete it. So I think it just feels nice. It's almost like an online diary I don't mind other people reading. So this participant really talks about that change over time, how they used to follow those norms and now they don't anymore. And you can really see that now that they've stopped following the norms and really focus on more how they want to use it, they talk about it in a lot more positive, so using words like nice and relaxed. Fourthly, the theme of connectedness showed that autistic participants used social media to connect with people that they both know from offline connections, so in-person connections, as well as new online communities that they found on social media. So firstly, there's that connection with offline people, so things like friends or family. And participant TF1 talked about this, and they said, the best thing about Facebook in the early days was I could see what my kids were up to. It was to spy on them. And although not all participants talked about spying on their kids, they did often talk about using social media in order to keep up with what old friends or family members were doing, and to keep in touch in a way that was really low effort and lighthearted. So a like here or there, a quick comment, or a post. Participants also talked about using social media to connect with online communities around special interests or shared experiences. And we can see this in the next example of participant F2. And she said, it's helpful in some ways, as I say, because I found groups related to my writing or to my son's needs or to my needs. And so in many ways, it's been helpful. So this really shows this safe space potential that I mentioned earlier as a real way of how autistic people are using social media. Our fifth and final theme was control. So there are two ways in which participants talked about control. Firstly, they generally wanted to be in control of the platform, so what they can see when they first log in and the order of the timeline. So many people preferred chronological timelines. Participant T3, for instance, says, if I went in and I wanted, for example, to see all the tweets related to Scottish Wildcats, I could just choose that structure. And if I could choose the structure, that would be really good rather than have it dictated to me, right? So this preference for having a choice and following personal preferences for how they can interact with the platform. And the second type of control was about controlling interactions and making sure they could avoid misunderstandings and conflict. So this participant talks about using non-text features, so things like acronyms or emojis, in order to be clear about what they mean. It helps me to convey exactly what I want to express, and sometimes an emoji does that, and sometimes an acronym does that. So what can we learn from these findings? So we have seen that social media designs can be facilitative, meaning they can make it easier to participate, but they can also be constraining, meaning they make it more difficult to participate. And important there is that autistic people have diverse needs and preferences and diverse experiences of social media. Therefore, as our participants mentioned, we found that autistic people need more options to adapt feeds and platforms to personal preferences. And while we'll have heard neurotypical people talk about similar difficulties with social media, for instance, they don't know what to post or what an emoji means, for autistic people, this is tied with a long history of being stigmatized and forced to change behavior. And we argue that platforms are currently not doing enough to be inclusive to autistic people. So thank you so much for your attention. We have our references here. And I'm, of course, happy to answer any questions during the Q&A part of this panel after all presentations have been given. And I will now hand back to the chair.
Thanks so much, Martina. Really interesting to hear some of the pros and cons of social media for this group. And it'll be really interesting to see how the social media platforms use data like this, if they use it, to change for the better and give that kind of level of control and personalisation that the autistic users, and I think we could probably all benefit from. But yeah, it'll be interesting to follow how they adapt over the years. We'll now move on to our next speaker. This is our last speaker for the seventh presentation, and that's Karri Gillespie-Smith.
Hello, so I'm Karri Gillespie-Smith, and I'm going to be talking to you today about a recent research project we did at the University of Edinburgh. And it's a qualitative study with autistic adults exploring perceptions and experiences of online and offline friendships with neurotypical and neurodivergent partners. So there's a lot of literature on friendship and autism, and I'm not going to have time to go into it all today, but I will include it in a PDF so you can read it in your own time. To really recap though, the current study wanted to extend this friendship literature, which is today only mostly focused on child and adolescent groups, binary gender influences, so we know gender is important in how relationships and friendships are formed, with girls preferring to have it based around talking and spending time together, whereas boys tend to have friendships based around activities. We also wanted to extend it not to just look at in-person friendships or online-only friendships, but to have a comparison between the two. And we wanted to be more inclusive, so we wanted to really try and represent these intersectional identities in autism as well. So to do this, we wanted to include people who identify as non-binary, and also those autistic people who don't speak. And we wanted to explore the following question, which is, what are autistic adults' perceptions of both online and offline friendships with neurotypical and neurodivergent partners? So after we got ethical approval from the university, we recruited and interviewed participants between 2020 and 2021. So this was COVID lockdown time. There was 3 interviewers, 2 who were non-autistic and 1 who was autistic who does not speak. And all the participants were interviewed using the preferred method of communication. And we can see an outline here of our participants. Following this, the interviews were transcribed and analysed, and we had four key themes emerge. So we had perception of friendship, friendship differences in neurodivergent and neurotypical groups, the role of technology, and impact of COVID-19 on socialising. Again, due to time constraints, I won't have time to go into absolutely every sub-theme, but I'll try and pick out the things that we thought were really interesting that came out of the results. So our first main theme, perceptions of friendship, and the first sub-theme within this theme was support and belonging. So again, autistic participants explained how they liked friendships because it gave them a sense of belonging. The next sub-theme was making friends. And this was quite interesting because our autistic participants would talk about having to manage their special interests or manage attention to know how often they should be checking in or when they shouldn't be checking in. And we hear from Michael, who talks about having to manage his special interests when he's interacting. It's important to start off in what they're interested in, and that's how people become interested in someone on the spectrum. The next sub-theme was friendship across the lifespan. And we heard from the autistic participants that the view of friendship changed from childhood to adulthood. And what they thought friendship should be was very much driven by a neurotypical narrative. So we have Hannah here say, when I was younger, I had this very idealistic idea and concept of what friendship was supposed to look like. So I took a lot of my cues from TV, but mostly from books, and how friendships were described there. But what I found was that in practice, friendships were rarely that way. I experienced a lot of putting more energy and emotion into my friendships than maybe was necessary because I wouldn't get the same amount back. And so that was really disappointing as a kid. The next sub-theme was barriers to friendship. So most of our autistic participants talked about how it was difficult to distinguish between a friend and an acquaintance, and also how it's difficult to manage expectations, what was expected of them. So we have Emily here who says, I get really stressed out, I'm insecure about my friendships, so sometimes I just disappear for a bit. Sometimes I get overwhelmed of talking to so many people, etc. I'm scared, I'm clingy, so I'll ghost people, stuff like that. I find it hard to predict what people want or need from me. So the next slide is about our next theme, which was friendship differences in neurodivergent and neurotypical groups. So the first sub-theme that came up within this theme was autistic identity. And participants mentioned how having their autistic identity really made them understand themselves and relatedly then be able to relate to others and understand others as well. So we have Michael here who said, I had no friends in primary school at all. But because autism wasn't known at the time, it wasn't fair in the school because they didn't know anything about it at the time. But then when I progressed into secondary school, the school already had people on the spectrum, and I felt like a hero in secondary school in terms of how respectful and how nice all of the students were towards me. Because I was that bit different, people treated me with such dignity and respect. So Michael was really talking about how he wasn't diagnosed until he was in secondary school, and how once he had this diagnosis and he had this autistic identity, things changed for him. The next sub-theme was differences in making friends. So our autistic participants talked about how it was different to make friends with neurotypicals compared to neurodivergent. So Noelle talks about her neurotypical friends and says, with neurotypical friends, I constantly feel like I am playing a game without knowing the rules and I could get thrown out at any moment. I am hyper-aware, ultra-masking, over-analysing everything. With autistics, it just comes naturally. I say things without filtering and they just understand me. First time I experienced it, I was so stunned. I didn't know what it felt like not to have to translate myself for other people. Our next sub-theme was differences in online socialising. So participants mentioned how they thought that neurotypical and neurodivergent people did online socialising for different reasons. So they mentioned that neurotypicals seem to use online interactions to maybe plan or organise in-person interactions, unlike neurodivergent people who would socialise online for socialising's sake. So we have Noelle here again saying, I think we form friendships using tech and use tech to build a friendship and keep it more. I think neurotypicals use tech to find people to then socialise with in real life. So then our next main theme was about the role of technology. And there was lots of talk about how technology has really helped autistic people make friends and maintain friendships, especially those who were kind of online gamers. So our first sub-theme was technology as a facilitator. Our second sub-theme was benefits to socialising online. So most participants believed that it was much easier to communicate online and develop friendships. And they thought that this was because they were able to share similar interests and values and really find their community. So we hear from Noelle again. Back in my youth, you could only make friends with people at school, work, social clubs. I wasn't even surfing the net until my 20s. Now I can find my community so much more easily. So this is about being able to find like-minded people online, and it really helps them to feel belonging. There was also mention here during this theme of the really usefulness of emojis, because they find that useful to communicate and to also have it in text that comes back to them, because it then allows them to understand the emotional tone associated with the written communication. So that was quite interesting. The next sub-theme was preference still for in-person interactions. So regardless of benefits of online socialisation, there was still some preference for some in-person interactions. So we have Noelle again, who says the only advantage of face-to-face is hugs. I have hyposensitivity to touch, so I love tight hugs. And then our next main theme, our final main theme, is impact of COVID-19 on socialising. And the first sub-theme was increasing empathy. So our autistic participants said that they seemed to feel as though neurotypicals understood their perspective more since COVID, because it really allowed them to experience loneliness and isolation. So we hear from Alice here. It's just been business as usual, but for them, she means neurotypical friends, they're like, oh, we need to check in. So in some ways, I feel like they've checked in with me more because they've been more conscious of people being lonely. Whereas before, I feel like they didn't realise how lonely other people could get. And I've been lonely, so I've always known about that. But I feel like they have only just realised what loneliness is because of lockdown. Our next sub-theme was benefits of lockdown. So our participants mentioned how it was really nice during lockdown because they didn't need to mask or camouflage as much and didn't experience the burnout that was normally related to this. However, contradictory as well, they also mentioned how there was a negative impact where they felt as though they'd lost practice in masking. So we hear from Mary, who says, I do feel like I get out of practice with masking, with remembering the rules and sticking to behaviours that aren't going to harm people. So the current study aimed to use a more inclusive approach and explore autistic adults' perceptions of friendships. And we did see how they mentioned key differences between neurotypical friendships and neurodivergent friendships. And this is related to not needing to mask or camouflage as much around neurodivergent friends. So this is in line with a kind of key autistic-led theory, double empathy. There was also mention about special interests when making and maintaining friends, and also about kind of managing attention. And this links to another theory, monotropism, again another autistic-led theory. And this could offer an interest-based account of relationship formation and maintenance in autism, which could be explored further. Finally, there was some interesting mention around diagnosis and the importance of diagnosis in helping to form the autistic identity, and that this then allowed the participants to understand themselves and others, and others a bit more. This also allows them to reach out to others in a more, what they think is productive way. And this is related to other literature that shows that diagnosis and autism identity can protect against poor mental health outcomes. So, and then some main conclusions, and I just want to thank you for listening. Feel free to contact me if you have any other questions.
Thank you, Karri, for that. Really interesting to hear some of the kind of longer term positive impacts of the pandemic. Obviously, we talk a lot about the negative ones, but to hear about that increased level of empathy, and it'll be interesting to see sort of if that's something that lasts. And also about emojis, that seems to be a recurring theme. I know that's something that came up when we were developing the Molehill Mountain app for Autistica. Definitely the autistic users really wanted to be able to input emojis into their diary to kind of explain how they were feeling. So yeah, definitely a common theme there. So we've had all of our presentations and we're now ready for the Q&A. So I'd like to invite all of our speakers into the Q&A. We've got lots of you, so we'll do our best to cover as many questions as we can. I think we're definitely going to get to one question per person. And then we're going to put email addresses for, I think, most of you into the chat so that anyone whose questions we don't reach can maybe reach out to you on email. So I'll just get the questions up now. I'll start, we'll go in order in which you presented. So I've got one here for Laura, first of all. So Laura, why do children from special education schools struggle with the interview?
I think it was a range of different issues depending on children. So I asked parents in their questionnaires to give feedback on this. So we've gathered quite a lot of data from parents for what were barriers to the interviews. So we can use those going forward, but it was things like attention was quite difficult. Even though it was split into chunks, it was just something that some kids weren't interested in doing. Some kids were really self-conscious about being on camera. So we did end up changing it halfway through and so that people could reply in written format if that was easier, or quite a few children chose to just send voice recordings in. And I think for future studies, we'll do that straight away from the start. Like, I didn't think about the fact that even though I wasn't there, it might still be quite stressful to be sat on camera. And then for a few kids, I think it was just verbal ability. So we did ask for, we didn't have enough time to unfortunately include low or non-verbal children in the study. But I think some kids that were at special school might have just struggled a lot with expressing verbally what it was they wanted to say. But we've gathered tons of data on this from parents. I'm hoping that going forward, we can make it loads more accessible.
Great, good to hear that you were able to sort of make some changes halfway through. Excellent. And the next question I have is for Emre. How did your findings compare to sibling bullying between neurotypical siblings?
That's a really good question. First of all, I'm really sorry for using a puzzle piece symbol at the end of my presentation. I was not aware of its published history and this was not intentional. The other panelists and the Autistica members kindly let me know about the autistic communities and Autistica's viewpoint on this on the backstage. To answer the question about how do our findings compare to sibling bullying between neurotypical siblings, well, from the literature, what we know is that autistic children are more likely to experience sibling bullying or negative sibling interactions than their neurotypical peers. This is what researchers have so far reported. And built on this, researchers have suggested that autistic children may experience or show higher levels of internalizing and externalizing problems than their peers, neurotypical peers, due to experiencing a higher level of sibling bullying at home. Also, what we know from the literature is that sibling bullying is highly correlated with peer bullying. So if a person is bullied at home, it's more likely that they will be bullied at school as well. So that we know that autistic children are more likely to be bullied at home. This puts them in a dangerous position at school to be bullied as well. And the consequences of peer bullying is higher for autistic children as well in the literature. Also, in the general, in the neurotypical researchers mostly have done research on the neurotypical population. So we know more about what happens when a neurotypical child gets bullied, but we know very little about what happens when an autistic child experiences bullying at home or at school. So what we are doing now is trying to replicate studies that have been done on the neurotypical population in the autistic sample and to learn more about what happens when they experience sibling bullying or peer bullying.
Excellent, great to hear about your future research in that area. My next question goes to the research group. So I gather you've decided who's going to answer this question. Over to AutSPACEs. When will the platform have use for the general public or autistic people, and how will it be used in practice?
So in terms of being used by the general public, I'm hesitant to give an exact date because there's lots of technical complexity in the development of the platform. So one of the issues we're having at the moment is trying to be really careful about the back end where the data is stored, because we know that making data secure is a massive priority for many autistic people. But we also want to make sure that it's able to be moderated. So that means people need to be able to look at the data. Autistic people need to be able to look at the data to make sure it complies with moderation guidelines that have been co-created. So there are elements of the co-creative process and the platform development that make it quite hard to be very specific about when it will be publicly launched. But we're looking for people to user test the platform. We have a version of it which is a kind of test version where you can enter experiences and try it out. So if anyone is interested in that, that would be fabulous. We would love to have you as part of the AutSPACEs community. And how it will work is basically we're looking for people's stories of sensory processing in their daily lives. So how are you affected by things in your environment as you go about your day? We will ask people to enter those experiences, but you'll have other options, for example, uploading a video or recording your voice, and use that to then apply some natural language processing to cluster together some of the common threads of experience that people have, which we can then use to inform policy decisions, adapt environments, advise on the management of public spaces so that they're more accessible to autistic people, but also ideally not just accessible. The ideal is to have environments where autistic people can really flourish. At the moment, I think there's a lot of hidden barriers and disadvantages that autistic people face. And while we have a narrative of the problem is with autistic people, they need to adapt, or even we need to make things accessible, that's setting, I think, a very low bar of what's possible if we actually give autistic people the resources and environments they need to fully flourish and unlock all of that immense potential. So that's a very brief overview. I think Susanna would like to add her take as well.
Yeah, so I think as Georgia said, it's all about helping autistic people flourish, and the site itself, I believe, can play a really large role in that. It gives people an opportunity to post their experiences, and writing is a brilliant form of processing. And so knowing that you can put something out there in what is a safe space. We have no comment section on the AutSPACEs site, so there's no risk of people questioning you or telling you that you're wrong. And then the kind of second half to that is that it also gives you the chance to see other people's experiences, which makes you feel less isolated, but could also potentially give you tips and advice on how to cope in certain situations. So, for example, I wear earplugs. That may not be something that another autistic person has thought of before, but if they read that, oh, maybe I'll try that. And then that can lead to them potentially having an easier time when they are out and about in certain environments, attempting to socialize. And of course, this all then leads on to research. And, we hope that this data will be used effectively and will be taken seriously because, in my experience, my individual accounts have never actually been taken seriously. But yeah, it really is sort of, there are multiple benefits to this project, and that's what makes it so exciting. I do personally come from a media background, so it was really exciting to hear what both Martine and Karri were saying. And I think essentially we're trying to take those benefits of social media, but make it completely safe. And that's just really beneficial to autistic people.
Fantastic. And I think we're going to put a link to your, I think, Twitter, and I know that you've got various links on there to kind of subscribe for updates for the project, and also to kind of take part in the testing. So hopefully we'll be able to add all of those links into the chat now for anyone that wants to have a look at what they've been up to. My next question is for Caroline. This is from Susanna. She congratulates all of you for your presentations today. She said, is AutAngel in a position to teach others how to how to create a peer mentor program in their local community?
Right, thank you. We don't have Well, my understanding of peer mentoring is much more a one-to-one thing, which is something we don't really do officially. So what the program, we have groups. We basically run groups because we found that sort of a safer way for people. During the pandemic, we actually did do a bit of peer mentoring, sort of pairing people up, and that just caused a lot more safeguarding issues. What we did have was a group called Activate Autistic Community. So it was a group for people who were wanting to start peer support groups online. It's just finished. And although through that we've gathered a lot of information as to how to do it, because we had a Slack, it felt like people came along to that and left, and only one actual group has resulted from it. So that's not an ongoing thing, but if people are interested, they can contact us. And if there was enough interest, we might start that again. And we might also put something out. And we're currently running a training program, but again, only for people who have been through our Exploring Being Autistic program. So slowly, I suppose, our stuff will spread, but we don't directly either do peer mentoring or help other people do it.
Great, thank you. And I know, Susanna, you've just added to the chat that you'd like to give an answer to that one as well.
No, sorry, that was in response to the question that Mercedes just posted in the chat.
Okay, no problem. Sorry for that. Just bring you in there. Now I have a question for Stewart. This is from someone called Colin Newton. He's a Christian believer on the autistic spectrum. He's asking, have you considered possible examples of autistic behaviour recounted in the Bible? He said that there's not enough space to list a few examples, but one could be some of the Psalms, reading very much like a person, going into meltdown and then emerging again.
Yeah, thank you. So I think the honest answer to that is yes and no, which is helpful, I understand. Grant McGaskill is a professor up at Aberdeen University. He's on the spectrum himself, and he's published a book called Autism in the Church, and he takes on this subject quite extensively. And what he argues is that that line of thinking is not necessarily very helpful in that the writers at the time would not have been using the categories of thought that we have to talk about or think about autism or autistic people. Were there autistic people in those days? Of course. And are there passages in the Bible which can be of help and support to people who are perhaps going through a meltdown process? Then absolutely. At one level, we talk about meltdowns as something that autistic people are familiar with, but others also. It's a human process that might have some particular sort of prompts and aggravating factors in the autistic space. But absolutely. So the answer to that is, I get the question. I get why it's an interesting question. It probably, although it's a fun question, it's not that helpful to try and extract out of the Bible. And that's one of the issues that one faces in the Christian community. There are many things. You can't just look up autism in the Bible. It doesn't tell you anything. And many of the issues, and there's another question there which I won't go into, but about the relevance of the church today and so on and so forth. I could speak for hours on that, but somebody else needs to come in. So.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stewart. I've now got a question that's actually to go to Martina and Karri. You've both mentioned emojis and how autistic people use them. Can you tell us a bit more about this from the perspective of your studies?
Yes, yeah. Trying to figure out who goes first. Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, because emojis were a very polarizing topic, I think, in our participants, where some people found them really helpful, because they could help really indicate the tone of the message, because they had a lot of experience of being misunderstood and those misunderstandings leading to conflict. And so putting a smiley face or a little heart next to the message really helped indicate that it was a positive message and avoid any of that conflict. But we also had participants who did not like emojis at all, did not use them, did not understand them, and just preferred that they weren't there. Specifically with the more complex facial expression emojis, you know, the simple smiley face was usually fine, but nowadays there's, I want to say hundreds, but there's definitely tens of different. The tongue is in a slightly different angle, and now there's two eyes closed or just one, right? And what is the difference between all of those little ones? And that was definitely something that our participants talked about as a negative, because it really made it difficult to understand. And in saying that, I should also say I just want to thank all of our participants, because I did only 12 minutes for the presentation isn't a long time, and we really appreciated everyone's input.
Yeah, can I just also chime in as well there and say that thank you to Minds, because like Martine, I ran out of time towards the end as well, and my alarm going off as well. I was trying to time myself. Typical.
Very diligent.
So just to come in there, I think we didn't hear too much negative from our participants, and I don't know if that was because we had a presence of autistic people who didn't speak, and they thought it was quite good to use them and also to receive, because they felt as though it help them understand the tone of the conversation. But I think that actually made me think it's maybe worth looking at my data to see if there were some themes that emerged for those who don't speak versus the ones who do use the verbal speech to communicate, to see if there are any differences that come up round about emoji use. That would be quite interesting to look at.
Excellent, thank you both for that. And so I've now got a question that I think would probably apply to everyone. So if you want to answer this, just kind of physically raise your hand and I'll sort of bring you in. So what do you think is the most important factor for those who seem to struggle to start and keep social relationships? Susanna, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, I shall lower my hand first. Yeah, so obviously I am autistic, and I wasn't diagnosed until I was 15, which is quite early for a female with highly cognitive capabilities, but for me that was late because I went through school without that diagnosis. And I think a lot of learning how to cope in certain situations is learning to understand yourself. So until I started to admit why things were difficult, you know, they were just difficult. And particularly as a teenager, you know, my friends would be like, oh, let's go do this. I'd be like, no, why would you want to do that? Because it just sounded horrible to me. And that meant that I was left out a lot. But I've now sort of come to terms with that, and I've accepted that, okay, well, yes, this is my best friend and he's celebrating his birthday here, but I know I won't cope in that environment. So we'll celebrate separately elsewhere. And that missing out on those individual socializations isn't going to completely destroy the friendship. He understands me, they understand me. You've just got to be open. And it really is a matter of experimenting and working out what your own limits are and not pushing them, because it is far worse to go to an event and have a meltdown and ruin the night and embarrass everyone than not turn up at all. And I think that's something that probably took me close to 10 years after diagnosis to really fully understand and accept.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Susanna. I've just realised we're 2 minutes over and we're probably going to end up going at least 5 minutes over. So if anyone's watching and really needs to go, don't worry, this will be recorded. You can come back and catch up at a later date. But I know that all of our speakers sort of wanted to get to this question, so we'll cover this before we finish. So if anyone else wants to chime in, I saw a few hands earlier. Stewart?
Thank you. I think, yes, just to add to that, I would add reciprocity and dialogue. Which is one of the reasons I'm so keen to look at, for example, faith communities, because I think they have the potential for providing supportive environments for autistic people. The word being potential. I thought Caroline was great in a way that she summarized the way that communities, because they have their own values and their own misunderstandings and assumptions, as well as the confusing world of autism, where you've got the professional, medical, scientific world and the autism advocacy world. And she's right about some of the big charities, and I, represent one of them, so I know we don't always help. So it's a very confusing world, and communities have their own themes. So I think when you get into a situation where what you were trying then gets something coming back that sort of says, yes, that's good, let's keep going, and you get a positive dialogue, then I think that helps to sustain things.
Excellent. Did anyone else have an answer for that question? Thank you, Caroline. Go for it.
Yeah, so I'd like to, well, echo a lot of what Susanna said, but essentially, I think that going to autistic majority spaces is just really helpful for developing that. So it's really difficult to develop self-esteem and self-confidence by yourself. You need to have it mirrored back, your situation, and that's really what we're trying to do at AutAngel, is provide these groups. And then once people feel safe in that group where other people actually understand them, they feel more able to be authentic outside of the group. And authenticity can help build friendships rather than masking, where people will get a sense of you not being authentic when you're just trying to make friends and be normal. So to me, the really key point in developing social relationships would be developing them with peers initially, which is other autistic people.
Fantastic. Before we close, did anyone else have anything else to add? Yes, Susanna.
Well, can I just conclude on that? Because I think obviously here both Caroline and Stewart are talking about communities, and from my experience, you go through education, you're in a structural environment, and then you leave, and there is a significant lack of support for people in that transitioning stage. And that's the issue that I found. Yes, I found communities at uni, I went to societies, I made friends. Just so happened we were probably all on the spectrum, but that's because it was a Doctor Who society, so what do you expect? But as soon as I left that environment that had structure, it was like I was all on my own. And I think that is something that society and I guess the systems that supposedly support us need to start thinking about more, because not all of us go straight from uni to work. And so for a lot of us, there is that big gap where we are just left alone. And again, there's a real gap that I've found in research for those young adults as well. So I think that's just my final point, is I think there is potentially a lack of support for people at a certain age, and I think that needs to change in order to help people continue developing relationships after they've left an educational system.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for summing that up, Susanna. That was an amazing session. Thank you so much. We've covered a lot of ground, but yeah, we're over time and we need to break for lunch, and everyone needs some time away from their screens. So we're going to finish up now. Thank you so much to all of our speakers for your excellent presentations and for joining us in the Q&A. It's been brilliant. And thank you to our audience who have given us lots of questions. As I said before, the questions we didn't cover, please go out to the individual speakers if we've got email addresses for them. I think most of them have shared their contact details, so you can go out and ask those questions then. And join us again. We've got the poster session at 1 p.m. Again, sort of all of the presentations and poster sessions and everything are recorded. So if you want to come back and have a longer break and catch up at another time, please do. And we hope to see you later. Thanks so much for joining us, and have a good lunch break.